Hey everybody, it's Sean. In this video, I'm going to be walking you guys through something called layer styles in Photoshop. Layer styles are a great set of tools that we can use to provide some customization and some added realism and kind of cool effects to our layers in Photoshop. So we're going to be looking at a couple different examples to see how we can apply some layer styles to make our images come to life. All right. So first off, when we start looking at layer styles, let me show you really quickly what layer styles kind of are from a menu perspective. So we have our layers on Photoshop, and if we double click on a layer, you'll notice that this dialog box layer styles pop up. And all of these options here are referred to as layer styles. So you have bevel and emboss, you have stroke, inner shadow, inner glow, color overlay, gradient overlay, things like that. These are all layer styles, and you can customize them. You can use some or all or just one to create a wide variety of really awesome effects in Photoshop. That's kind of just a brief, quick overview of where the menu is and what are some of the features that are available on it. We're going to go over a couple of different examples in this video of things we can do with layer styles, but before we actually get into all of that, I want to explain something that's really important in terms of understanding these things. The first one is really the difference between fill and opacity. So on my left-hand side here, I have an example of an object that has a black color fill applied to it. And as we can see over here on our layers panel, we have something called opacity, and then we have something called fill. If I click and drag to the left on my opacity, you'll notice that I can lower the opacity, and so my shape becomes more transparent, allowing me to see what is behind it. The other option I have here is called fill, and fill basically is referring to the transparency of the effects that are applied to the layer. So right now, because I have no effects, you can see here, here's an effect icon. I have no effects on this. So if I lower my fill, it looks like I'm lowering the transparency of my layer. In reality, these are two very different settings. So on the right here, I have an example of fill. Let me kind of just show you. So if I lower the opacity of this layer, you'll notice that I am lowering the opacity of all objects that are on it, and I can see what is happening in behind it. However, because I have a gradient overlay effect, this gradient overlay effect kind of supersedes whatever fill color is being applied to my layer. So if I lower my fill from 100% down 50, 40, 18 to 0, you'll notice that my layer doesn't actually change in appearance. This is because all it's doing is lowering the opacity of the fill appearance, not the actual opacity of my layer style appearance, right? So for example, if I wanted to show you guys this gradient overlay, it has its own opacity setting, and that's where I would go and adjust the opacity of that specific gradient. I wouldn't do it using fill or opacity up here. So kind of playing around and understanding the difference between opacity and fill is a fairly important concept when we think about layer styles and how they can affect our overall compositions. To get going and to sort of put a lot of this into context, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get going on recreating this kind of effect. So I have two shapes. I've applied effects that make them look like sort of glassy neon tubes, and they have a really cool outer glow effect. So we're going to work on rebuilding this. It's really simple, super easy, but it goes through a few of our standard sort of design practices in Photoshop, like good layer organization. We get to use the shape builder tool for a change, and we really get to dive into what layer styles can and cannot do. So to get going, you guys have a layer styles folder available to you. I'd like you guys, I also just realized I don't think I've given you the actual picture to be able to play with this one yet. So give me a second here. Where'd it go? I found it. So you guys should have this file available to you. It's the Ian Unsplash image. So let's go ahead and just click and drag this and open it up into Photoshop. So once you have it open up in Photoshop, what I'd like to do is create our sort of triangle shape here that sort of encompasses around the hand. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the pen tool, so the letter P on the keyboard for pen tool, and I'm just going to kind of draw out a triangle shape that I like. And before we actually close this shape, what I want to mention is to come up here to the top left corner, make sure you have this set to shape and not path. The reason being is because when we have this set to shape, we have a few more options available to be able to play around with that will help us create this effect. So just come up here to the top left and hit shape. Okay, then we can go ahead and close the shape, and now we have a new shape layer sitting right over here in our layers panel. And we have the ability to control some of the attributes of this. So I would like this shape to have no fill. So if you do have a fill, just come over here and select this no fill icon. I'd like it to have a white stroke. So come on over to the stroke selection and choose white. And let's make it maybe 20 pixels and see what that looks like. 20 pixels looks pretty good to me. Excellent. And this is kind of the fun part. This is where we get to look at our blending modes and start creating these really cool glowy, glassy effects. This might be review for some of you guys, and for some of you it might be brand new information. So we're just gonna take it together and learn some cool new tricks. So I'm just referencing my original here for a second. On this layer, what I would like to do first of all is lower the fill value from 100% down to 0. You'll notice our shape totally disappears here, and that's fine. We're going to be bringing it back in a moment. Okay, so double clicking on shape 1 on the layer, you'll get this layer styles panel that opens up. Once this opens up, we have a few things that I'd like to take a look at. But the first one, for the sake of being able to see our shape again, we're going to look at creating a gradient overlay. Gradient overlays are kind of cool. They act like a standard color overlay, but you can obviously apply a gradient to them. And once you click on gradient overlay, you'll have access to this menu right here, where you can decide your own blending mode for this overlay. We've looked at blending modes a lot recently. You can decide if you want it to be linear, radial, angular, all these other sort of things. I'm gonna leave this at linear for now, and scale, angle, things like that. What I'm really interested in though are the colors. So you can do one of two things. You can click directly on the gradient sort of image itself, and it'll open up this whole big slider where you can choose customized colors completely 100% to your liking, or you can go and scroll through these folders. I think Photoshop in a new update did a really fantastic job at providing us with a lot of really great preset jumping off points for gradients. These are nicely built gradients and a variety of different uses. For what I would like to do, I'm going to be looking at the iridescent panel. And what I'm trying to look at when I'm choosing my colors are the colors that are present in this image already. So we have this kind of cool blue highlight happening. We kind of have some magenta happening over here as well. So I want to find colors that are going to reflect that to make it feel a little bit more realistic in our composition. And I know within the iridescent panel, there's this iridescent 11 swatch here that seems to work fairly well for what I kind of want it to do. So I'm quite happy with that. I can just go ahead and select that and hit OK. If you guys really do want to try something else though, by all means, feel free to pick your own color palettes. Totally up to you. Now I'm noticing I'm getting some of these sort of like tealy blues happening down here. I kind of want them to be closer to up here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to change the angle of my gradient so that those blues kind of match the right area. So maybe something around there. So negative 55 degrees. And great. So now I have a gradient overlay. well situated, everything looks good. Next up, we're going to take a look at our bevel and emboss effect. Bevel and emboss is a pretty cool. It's a pretty cool effect. It can look really tacky if you don't do it well first. So, or if you don't set it up well. So it's kind of crucial to make sure that we start off on a good foot here. Just to remind myself of what I did, I'm going to go back to my original and take a look at the settings that I had here. Okay, cool. So inner bevel, smooth, 100%. Okay, great. Excellent. Cool. Jumping back over to here, I'm just going to double click to get back into my inner bevel settings. So I have inner bevel, smooth. We can maybe up the size, not too much. Maybe like 18. 18 looks like it's pretty good. Depth, we could definitely increase the depth a little bit more. I want there to be a strong highlight, so I'm going to increase the opacity on the highlight section, and I want there to be 0 shadows coming through. Okay, shading, I don't know, maybe somewhere around like the 50-degree angle seems to look nice. The great thing about layer styles is you kind of get this real-time feedback loop right over here in this icon, and it'll show you like the type of changes that you're making, so you can actually see where your highlights are going to come from and what they could possibly look like. So that's pretty nifty. Yeah, we're just going to leave the size there. It really just does come down to a lot of playing. Like you can see if we switch directions, you can see where the highlights are going to move and go to. The other thing with bevel and emboss is you have different types of bevels and emboss. So you can have an outer one, and you can sort of see if I zoom in the effect that it has, like the changes that it has on the neon tube, we'll call it. Outer bevel sort of positions the shine and the bevel on the outside of our shape. Inner brings it to the inside, and so you can sort of see I get a crisper line on the interior. And then we get emboss, which is not the effect I'm going for. This would obviously make it look like something is raised off of the page. And then we get like a softer version of the emboss and then a stroke emboss. So all cool things to play around with when you guys have time. But for our purposes, I'm looking for an inner bevel. Okay, cool. And next up, we can sort of take a look at the glass contour. So how does the light reflect off of the glassiness of our emboss? How does it interact with the material, quote unquote? I just zoomed out a little bit, and I'm going back into the layer style menu here. So all of these different curves will have a slightly different effect. It's kind of just up to you to choose the one that you think looks the best and the coolest for your application. Luckily, all of these are looking pretty solid because we're working with such a delicate shape. There's not going to be a ton of detail to really have to pull through in here, and it's kind of more abstract. Obviously, if you're doing something that's very realistic, you're going to want to like make sure you choose a super realistic looking contour. So the more you play around with them, the more familiar you kind of get with the effects of the glass contour. And then what I'm going to come in here and look at again is another type of contour. This one is kind of an overall generalized one for the entire stroke or for the entire bevel effect, as opposed to just the glass and the glass itself. I have a feeling that this one here is probably going to be the best one. So the one that kind of curves up going towards the right. And I always want to make sure I'm selecting anti-aliased. This will just help smooth out any pixels and keep things from getting a little bit too choppy. Okay. The cool thing about the shape layer that we made is it's editable, right? It's non-destructive. I'm kind of looking at this and I want it to be a little bit thicker. So I'm going to close out of that layer style menu by hitting OK. And I'm going to make sure I have shape 1 selected. I'm going to come back over to my shape tool. And I'm just going to increase the pixel width from 20 maybe to like 25. Just so I can see a little bit more detail and get a little bit more of that cool glass effect that we were just building. All right. Let me just jump back to my original example and see what else we got going on. So we've covered bevel and emboss, we've covered gradient overlay. Next up is outer glow, which is a super fun type of effect. I'm just going to double click back on my shape 1 layer to open up my layer styles panel one more time. One thing to kind of note with the layer styles panel is some of these effects have plus buttons next to them. This means that you can double up on the effect. So I could have 2 gradient overlays. That might be beneficial if you decided that you wanted one to be a normal color blend mode, and then you maybe wanted the next to be like multiply or overlay or a slightly different blending mode for a different effect. So you can stack things and you can really get a lot of versatility and value out of these. I often find having multiple drop shadows really helps for realism's sake, so that's kind of cool. The only thing that you need to really keep in mind with this is this panel actually acts very similarly to the layers panel, meaning that the effects will stack on top of one another. So if I chose, for example, to have a second gradient overlay, and let me just change this to something very obviously different. So I'll make it orange. You'll notice now that my orange gradient overlay completely overtook my sort of pastel iridescent one. So you just kind of have to be aware when you are stacking effects, the order in which the effects are being stacked, okay? It sounds a little confusing at first, but the more you play around with it, the more you'll start to understand the flow of things. The other thing that's really kind of crucial to know is that these all have certain names, right? They imply certain types of effects. So like inner shadow, you assume it will make an inner shadow on your object, but that doesn't always necessarily have to be the case. So I know I'm getting a little carried away from the outer glow that I said we'd work on, but I just want to show you guys, for example, with inner shadow, you can see I have a black color and it's set to multiply. And we know from experience that multiply means it'll darken things. So if I increase the opacity a lot and I increase the size of my inner shadow, you'll notice that the inside of my tube like my glass tube starts to get really dark and not the greatest. However, we don't have to make this a dark color or a dark blending mode. We could change this from multiply to something like screen, and we could input like a really kind of cool bright pink sort of color. And you'll notice now that my inner glow is now it's much brighter. It has a subtle color to it, and you can sort of see my my preview changes over here to reflect the changes that we've made. I could also, instead of doing screen, I could do something like linear light, and you'll see that it takes on a much new type of appearance. It doesn't have to be so bold. We can lower the opacity on that, but everything now has a slightly like pink tinge to it, which is kind of cool. Actually, I really do like that. Wasn't included in the original version, but kind of looks really nice. You get these really cool sort of blue tones. You get these hot pink sort of tones coming through. I'm just going to lower the size of it a little bit more and lower the opacity of it a little bit more. So it's just subtle, you know? Okay. So, you know, don't be hindered by the name of the effect. There are many ways to customize these effects beyond what just their name states. And once again, I'm going to say this tons of times throughout this demonstration, but the more you play around with it and the more you experiment, the more you're going to find out about each of these blending modes. It kind of just comes with time and experience, but we're just here to sort of get exposed to them and to play around and see what we can create. So the last effect that we're going to apply in this case is going to be outer glow. And this does exactly what it stipulates it does, is it creates a really beautiful glow on the outside of our object. So for example, I want to make sure my blend mode is set to screen so that it will really help us increase the sense of highlights and soft lighting, colors, and glowiness. And just to really dramatize my point, I'm going to have the opacity set up super high, like 80%, and I'm going to increase the size to like, 50 or even like 65. And so you'll notice now we do get this crazy exterior glow happening. And, you know, once again, we have the ability to change the contour of our glow. So you can sort of change how it's being interpreted by Photoshop and by the shape. Oftentimes I find these do get very situational and really weird to have to play around with. So I kind of like just a standard linear contour for this myself. And once again, I'm just going to make sure it's set to anti-aliased. We do have a few other options here, so you can choose whether or not your glow is soft or precise. Precise does kind of exactly what it means, like it really shows the hard edge of our glow, whereas soft really tends to soften things out and make a nice, beautiful, smooth, fade out outer glow. Spread kind of refers to how much space it takes up within the contour, and size refers to how wide our actual glow is. So, you know, the wider your glow, the less opacity it's going to have most likely, because the light kind of falls off a little bit. So that's something to kind of be aware of. And unfortunately, outer glow isn't one of these effects that we can stack on top of one another. So you kind of have to be a little strategic with how you use it if you want to apply multiple instances of your outer glow. So I know I kind of keep clicking around and fiddling here. I'm just trying to make what I think looks the most appropriate for the time being. So for me, that's 75% opacity. That's an 80 pixel for the size. I want 0 spread, a nice linear contour, 50% range. Now the color, this is up to you to sort of figure out what kind of color you want to use. I think because we used a gradient for our tube that has multiple types of color, it would be best to try and match that. So I'm going to switch over to my gradient option by clicking on that sort of radial button there. And then I'm going to click on the gradient image, and I'm going to slide down until I find iridescent. And I'm going to choose the same iridescent number 11 swatch that we chose earlier. Great. Now this actually does look kind of bad when it's set to screen, so I'm going to try something else. I'm going to look at it under vivid light. That is pretty cool, but it's not the effect I'm going for. What about linear light? Linear light also does look pretty interesting. What if we lowered the opacity? It's not really doing it for me. I don't know about you guys. Let's see. You know what? I'm going to leave... Okay. I think I'm going to leave it like this for now. Again, the nice thing about these effects is they're non-destructive. You can come back and play around with them and see if you can fix it and fiddle with it as we move on. So I'm actually going to leave it as linear light, 65% and 18% pixel size. And we're going to build a second outer glow on top of this in a little bit and kind of massage the whole thing and make it feel a little bit nicer. The only other thing that I think I want to add to this is maybe just like 5 pixels worth of noise. I think 5. Yeah, 5, maybe even 13. 13 would be good. Basically what that's doing is it is adding in just the slightest amount of noise in this sort of section, helping to make it feel less vector and less like photoshopped and more realistically blended into the actual image itself. Cool. So I'm happy with all of these layer effects for now. The next step we can kind of look at is giving this some dimension, making it look like the hand is actually flowing through it like it is in our final example. So to do that, we're just going to make a simple layer mask like we've done tons of times already. I'm going to make sure I have shape 1 selected. I'm going to click on my layer mask option here, and I'm going to come over to my brush tool by hitting B on the keyboard or going over to brush. And in this case, I want to make sure I have a really a hard brush, so 100%. So I'm just clicking on my brush options up here, sliding this up to 100%. I'm going to lower this down, something smaller like 50 or 125 apparently, don't mind me. And I just want to make sure the opacity is set to 100%. And perfect. Okay, great. We can just sort of like quickly paint this out from over top of the hand. If you guys want to follow the same sort of direction I do, great. At least this makes it look like it's sort of disappearing in behind the wrist. If you didn't feel like maybe that direction is the cooler direction for you guys, and you want to play around with hiding it behind the fingers, what to do, and then we can kind of come down in here. Maybe something like that looks a little bit cooler to you. Whoops, went a little bit too far there. It'll also help if I just zoomed in to see what I was doing. That might work, you know? That might be nice. Okay. Awesome. You know, that's another option there too. It's kind of cool because you see it's like going over the hand, but like it's going to get stuck. Gives it a little bit of visual dynamicness that's a little bit different than what we're used to. That's pretty cool too. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now, in my example, we are doing it a little bit differently, which is kind of fun. That's the great thing about these sort of abstract tutorials is you can really do them however which way you want and have a lot of fun. So I'm going to duplicate my shape 1 layer by hitting Command J or Control J. If you wanted to, you could also just click and drag the layer down to the new layer icon and duplicate it that way. What happens when you duplicate a layer that has layer effects is it copies all of the layer effects with it. We're going to turn off a few of these and we're going to make some adjustments to a couple of other ones. So I can turn off the gradient overlay. I don't need it anymore. I can turn off the inner shadow because I don't need that anymore. And we can adjust our outer glow. So this time what I'd like to do is instead of having a gradient, I would like a solid color. I'd like it to be white, but with a subtle, like maybe pinkish hue to it. And we can go ahead now and we can make a really wide glow with a lower opacity than what we originally had. We can make it a little bit more wider than that, maybe a little bit more glowy, maybe like 40%. The noise we can reduce down to like 5%. Because it was looking a little bit too pixely. Just for reference, you can sort of see here the noise. Like the more you crank it up, the more, literally, the more noise, the more sort of junk you add into it. The less you have, the less you sort of get that effect. But it's still kind of important to have just a little bit of it because it helps trick our eye into thinking that it's still slightly realistic. And I think I'll leave the contour. Let me just double check one more time before I just like cycling through a few of them just to make sure I'm making the right decision. And I think I am. So yeah, nice big size, same contour, maybe 140 just to keep things nice and simple. And if you guys are ever curious to see the type of changes you're making, you can just go ahead and click on the preview button and you can see the difference that we've made just by duplicating this layer and making some subtle changes. We've kind of helped to fill in and sort of smooth and haze out some of these highlights that are happening. I'm also going to go and deal with the bevel and emboss that's happening now. I think I'm going to change the contour and see what type of effect that has on the situation. It might not have much of a big effect. You can see it's changing some of the highlights a little bit. Let me see here. Let's zoom in and take a closer look. So yeah, you can see we are changing the highlights. So it just kind of is cool because you can stack the bevel and emboss effect and really have some fun playing around with the glass and the shape dynamics of the whole thing and get a really kind of cool, tailored, customized look. You can also tone down the highlights, right? That's what these two colors represent. And you can tone them down. You could maybe, if you wanted to bring in some shadows, you could bring in some shadows. It's up to you. You could also play around with seeing what it looks like when it's, you know, beveled, but from below instead of from up top. If we switch down the depth, you can also sort of play around with having a deeper depth. So maybe you really want it to be super dramatic. That might have a cool effect. It is really minimal though, but you know, still kind of something cool to play around with. And once again, we can change the contour of the entire thing and get a slightly different look just for that added extra customization. So that looks like a fairly realistic glass, abstract, glowing tube, almost neon-esque style element. And the colors kind of are a little reflective of what's already in the scene, making it a little bit more believable, which is pretty nifty, in my opinion. Okay, so let me just see what I've done here. I know we duplicated this, we've added it to a group, and we applied another outer glow once again. Excellent. So what we can do for this next step is we can do exactly what it is sort of in the final, as we can group our two shapes here. So selecting both of them, hitting Command G or Control G on the keyboard to group them, or you could come down here and click on this group folder. So we kind of went over how to stack layer effects on individual layers. Now we can look at stacking layer effects on an entire group. So you can do the exact same layer effects on the group that you would do on a regular layer. The only difference is obviously on a layer, it's affecting just the objects on that layer, whereas in a group, you're affecting everything. So if you had a ton of stuff in this group, whatever you decided to apply a layer style to on this grouped folder, it would take effect. So for example, I'm just going to do something drastic like apply a color overlay, and you'll notice everything, including the glows that we applied, including the bevel and embosses, everything all of a sudden has this really bad gray color overlay. It overtakes everything because of how it sits on the layer stack. So you want to be really careful when applying layer styles to an entire group. You just want to make sure that whatever you do, it applies nicely and it flows well, and it sort of like actually, you know, does what it's supposed to. So in this case, I want to apply another outer glow because I want it to have a really soft, like wide drop fade off effect from this glass tube. So I just made a slightly pinker color. I lowered its opacity one more time, and I increased the size almost to the maximum. And I can just go ahead and hit preview again, and you can sort of see it does dull things down a little bit, but it does help to create more of that like cast off. We can also change it from linear to vivid, or from linear even to something like overlay, or maybe we can see what screen does. So, you know, changing these layer styles kind of gives you a little bit more kind of cooler options to play around with as well. In all honesty, I'm not in love with this. Let's try vivid. Let's see what happens when we increase the opacity. Oh, sorry. I was messing around with the noise. The opacity. Yeah, that's kind of cool actually, isn't it? Yeah, so for example, right now, vivid light looks even better at 50% and a super nice wide size. If we hit preview, you can sort of see you're getting even more of that glowing happening, and it's helping to sort of fill out the light that's falling off of our shape. If you wanted to, we're not going to, but things like drop shadows you could apply to the entire thing, just by, you know, I'm looking at the opacity here by increasing the opacity so we can see it more, and I'm going to shift the distance. You can sort of see how I get an actual drop shadow on the hand now. The only problem is I'm also getting a drop shadow on my background and on all these other spots that I don't want one. So if you're super realistic, there would definitely be a slight shadow forming on the hand. We can go in and build that ourselves in a moment, and we will, just using the brush tool. But for now, I'm going to accept those changes. I'm going to go ahead and relabel this group as Glow Triangle. That way we know things are nice and organized. I can relabel layer 1 as like Triangle Fill, because I know that I have like a gradient overlay. Like, it just helps to describe what's happening in there. And then I can relabel the duplicate we made as Triangle Light or Lighting, because that's kind of more what's happening there is we're adjusting the lighting. And then this whole folder represents our glow triangle itself. So just a nice, easy way to stay super organized and really consistent. Now, like I said, we were going to look at creating a subtle shadow on the hand just for realism. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer in between the background and the glow triangle, and I'm going to name this shadow. I want to use my brush tool, so I'm going to hit B on my keyboard, and I'm going to come up here to my brush shape options. I'm going to have 0 hardness, and I'm trying to think what I want. I want a brush size that's not too big, not too small, so about 150 pixels looks good. I definitely do not want 100% opacity, maybe like 50. And I want my foreground color to be set to black. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just click once down sort of by the base of the palm. And I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to come up to the top here, and I'm going to click one more time. And what you'll notice is that just kind of draws a straight line with our brush tool, so it's just very consistently the exact same pressure, the exact same opacity across the entire thing. It does look kind of, not the greatest right now, and that's fine. We still have to go in and kind of like massage the details slightly. I'm going to change it to soft light, so it's a bit of a softer shadow. I'm going to go ahead and lower its opacity to something like maybe 50%. Cool. And I did notice I got a little bit that bled off the arm, so I'm just going to use the eraser tool, and I'm just going to erase that in. Let me see here, if I was to just actually keep increasing the opacity, maybe even up to like 85%, then at least we can really see the shadow. Might even be a little bit too thick, so I'm just going to hit Command T for my transform tools, and I'm going to make some my computer's being really slow. Sorry guys. It's always kind of like this when we try and record Photoshop. It slows down. It's very sad and annoying. Anyways, it does feel a little bit thick. Maybe instead of the transform tool, because it's being super slow, I'm just going to use my eraser and just slim down my my shadow ever so slightly. I know it's not super consistent, but it's close enough. Does a really subtle job of hinting at the fact that there is a shadow being cast by the triangle itself. So there we go. So there's our triangle shape. The next thing that I wanted to show you guys quickly in terms of layer styles is how easy it is to keep consistent with them and to build other elements that use the same type of style. So here in the final example, I have a circular bracelet thing that's also happening, and I'll show you guys how easy it is to just duplicate what we've already done to another element. So on top of the glow triangle, I'm gonna just come over here and click on my ellipse tool. You guys might have rectangle or triangle or any of these other ones. Just go ahead and hold down until you see this menu and select ellipse. Okay, I'm gonna come up here towards my gentleman's wrist, and I'm just gonna click and drag out while holding down Option or Alt. And I'm going to drag out a nice sort of ellipse shape until I get something that looks like it could be a bracelet kind of around their wrist. Once again, making sure I have my ellipse tool selected, I'm just going to come up here and change the thickness of the stroke to something maybe more like 15 pixels instead of the 25, so it's a little bit more delicate. I'm going to go ahead and open up my glow triangle folder, and I'm going to come down here to the triangle fill one, and I'm going to hover over effects. I'm going to press and hold down Alt or Option on your keyboard, and I'm going to click and drag the effects all the way up to my ellipse. You should get this dual cursor effect with the black and white cursor and the little ghosted word effects. I'm just going to go ahead and drop that on my new ellipse layer, and it takes all of those effects that we spent so much time building and applies them to our new layer. next up, we can just do the same thing and duplicate this layer just like we did for the triangle lighting layer. This time I want to remove all of these effects because I don't need them. I need a specific few. So I'm just going to right click on this layer and I'm going to hit clear layer styles. Here you have three options. You have the ability to copy the layer styles, you have the ability to clear them, or you can paste them. So we're going to go ahead and hit clear. And now we should just have, if I turn off ellipse 1, we should just have a pure white, ellipse that we built originally. This time I'm going to show you the second way to copy our layer styles. I'm going to come down to triangle lighting. I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit copy layer style. After that, I'm going to come up to ellipse 1, I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit paste layer styles. So as always, there's always a keyboard shortcut and a menu option that you can choose to do a lot of these different effects. And I'm going to name ellipse 1 ellipse fill to stay consistent. And ellipse 1 copy, I'm going to name ellipse lighting, just like that. And now I want to make it look like it's hiding behind his wrist. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off ellipse lighting. I'm going to select ellipse fill and I'm going to hit new layer mask. Okay. And that will just allow me to create a new layer mask so that we can hide one of the sides of this ellipse behind his wrist. So select your layer mask, hit B on your keyboard or come over here and select the brush tool. Make sure you have black selected as your foreground color so that we can hide something. And we want to make sure we have 100% opacity, not just like 50 or 30 or something small like that. And I'm just going to kind of brush away 1/2 of the ellipse that hides behind the wrist. Okay, cool. Obviously, because my brush was a little bit soft, it sort of didn't give me the exact effect I was looking for. So I'm just going to zoom in using a harder brush at 100% hardness instead of 50% or 0%. And I'm just going to come in and sort of fix up some of the detail that I was having, just like that. And then zoom back out so I can see my whole thing. And now we have what looks like a bracelet that's, hiding in behind our person's wrist. I'm going to turn back on my lighting. And now I have to duplicate the mask so it's the same on both layers so we don't see this awkward sort of white line. So I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on my keyboard and click and drag the mask up to the ellipse lighting layer where it will duplicate it in the exact same position. And there we go. We've made this kind of really cool sci-fi surreal composition using simple shapes and just customized blend layer styles and some cool blend modes and things like that. And it kind of just makes this really nice dynamic composition. So, layer styles are something that the more you play around with them and expose yourself to them, the more you'll have a better understanding of them. They work really well on typography if you're trying to create custom type like neon signs or things like gold type where you need to have really strong gradients and gold texturing applied. Or you can use them to create drop shadows and add realistic shadows on elements that may or may not have belonged in your composition in the first time. I encourage you guys to play around with them as much as you can. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out and give me a shout. Cool. So there's some other cool things that we can do with layer styles and brushes within Photoshop, obviously. And we're going to take a quick look at that using some of the same techniques that we did in the previous example with the kind of cool futuristic neon shape effects. So to do that, again, I have a bunch of files in our layer styles folder. What I'd like to do is open up this Alice Unsplash image and drag it into Photoshop. So let me just look at our final example one more time to refresh my memory. Looks like we have a vignette layer here with a color overlay, and we have some glows happening with a color overlay and a glow effect. And once again, so kind of just layered up. Okay, cool. Super easy stuff. So we're going to be taking a look at how to create some custom brushes, some custom brush sizes, using layer styles once again, and just having some fun to create more of a surreal fantasy image from this really awesome, image provided to us from Unsplash. So to get going, first of all, what I'd like to do is create a more like a subtle vignette along the edges of our image. And to do that, we can just use a simple gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and hit G on my keyboard to bring up the gradient tool right over here. It might be hiding under the paint bucket or something like that. So just select gradient. And I'd like to use a radial gradient, so second in from the left. And something that always happens to me, I find I switch between having a gradient that looks like this, where it's opaque in the center and transparent on the outside, to wanting to have a vignette, something that's opaque on the outside and transparent on the inside. So to get a vignette, what we need to do is we need to go into our gradient selection sort of picker over here in the top left, click on that. Under basic, you'll notice that you have three options. You have like a foreground to background, you have a foreground to transparent, and then you have like another option which is kind of just customized to be whatever you want it to be. So I'm going to choose the middle option here, foreground to transparent, right? So we have an empty space on the right hand side. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And you'll notice that I quickly clicked this reverse button. If yours is black on the left, transparent on the right, you will get this sort of dark ball effect, which is totally useful. It has a lot of great applications, but for now we want the opposite. So instead of clicking back on your gradient and like clicking and dragging these guys around, and it takes like an extra minute or so to reverse your gradient to look like that, we can just very simply click reverse. And so the goal is to make sure the black is on the right hand side and the transparent is on the left. We can find our main subject and click and drag out a really nice and wide gradient. Maybe not that wide, but nice and wide gradient, so that we get a vignette effect around the edges, just like so, right? Just helps to draw the attention in towards the center of our image a little bit more. Awesome. I'm happy with that. So I used black, but what I actually want is a bluish, like a more blue tone gradient. So we can use layer styles to achieve this. What I'd like to do is just double click on layer 1 and select color overlay. And instead of this gross gray color that it's chosen for me, I'm going to go and select a nice deep blue tone. Something that's dark but not black, just because we have a lot of like soft blue shadows, and I kind of want to help preserve that. So something in that range seems to work well. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and I'm going to relabel this layer as vignette, just like so. And there we go. The cool thing about this too is if you ever felt like changing the color, you can double click on color overlay again. Let's say you want it to be pink for some reason, you can change that. You want it to be green, yada yada. I'm going to just leave it as it is, but again, non-destructive editing techniques, super fun, super easy, super cool. Now, in my example, I have these kind of cool floating glow orbs that are kind of fairy-ish, like floating around our main character. And to achieve that, it's a very simple technique in the brush tool. It's called a scatter brush. Now, up until now, we've been looking at our brush using this kind of, menu up here, or this menu here where you can choose the size and the hardness. There are a small variety of brushes that Photoshop comes built in with, but there's a whole other menu of tools available to us when we look at the brush tool. Where to find these is pretty easy. We can go up to Window and hit Brushes or Brush Settings, and it will load up this whole other sort of menu here. Personally, I find this menu to be fairly useful, depending on what you're trying to do. There's tons to learn and play around with in here, so I won't be able to cover it all. But what I did kind of want to show you guys is this thing called shape dynamics. Once you click on it, you get a fair amount of options to play around with. So you can choose the size jitter, so how uniform or ununiform is the edge of your brush. The diameter jitter kind of does something similar as well. And we can also adjust whether or not it uses like pen pressure, pen tilt if you use a stylus. Some people use like a stylus wheel. So there's other ways of controlling the jitter or the opacity or any of the attributions of these cool new brushes. The other thing that we can take a look at is something called scattering. So if we click on scattering, you'll notice that we can increase the scatter. We can increase the count. Oops, actually here, let me decrease the scatter. Let me increase on both axes. Axes, size jitter. What is going on? Sorry about that. I was noticing I was having some issues getting the scattering to work. So I just paused and came back. So we left off at scattering. If we click on scattering, you'll get this really kind of cool scattering effect. That's the goal. But to get that, we kind of have to make some changes first. So I want to go back up to the brush tip shape menu, and I just want to select a small size, something like maybe 10 pixels. I definitely wanted to have a 0% hardness, and the more spacing you apply, the kind of more spaced out your sparkles will be. So I don't know, something like 70% seemed to look nice for me. And then I went and adjusted the shape dynamics a little bit, but I'm still kind of leaving it size jitter at 69%. The control I'm just going to leave as off. I added an angle jitter, and so you can sort of see some of them go from being circular to like oval. And same with the roundness. If you want things to be beautifully round, you can leave that at 0. If you want a little bit of variation, you can increase it. And now when we come to scattering, obviously the wider or the more percentage, the higher your percentage, the wider the scattering effect will be. You can increase the count so that you can add more sparkles in a certain spot. Or you can also increase the count jitter so it's a little bit more random. The control literally just kind of refers to the like the style of how it's going to flow out. If you're using a stylus, something like pen pressure works well. Otherwise, you can just kind of leave it off and you'll still get the same effect. Personally, I find a count of 2 seems to work nicely for this effect, but it's up to you. So now, instead of having just a single brush, like that, you know, it's just a smooth shape and we can sort of just color stuff in with it, we have this brush that applies a really cool effect. And I will show you what I mean by painting some stuff on our image here. So I can increase the size of my brush from 13% or from 13 pixels up a little bit higher. And I want to make sure that I'm not set to pen pressure anywhere because that oftentimes causes problems. So you also want to make sure your flow is set to 100% so you can get the most color out of your brush. And if you just click and drag down a little bit, you notice that you get these sort of really cool, they're kind of random glowing orbs that start floating around your composition, which is pretty nifty. So that's kind of the effect we're going for. There's some added extra stuff that we can do in this menu, things like color dynamics. So if you had like 2 colors like bright, let's just say we set like a bright teal and like a bright pink color, something like that. Color dynamics lets you determine like, you know, do they fade from the background color to the foreground color? And there's just a few other options in there. So let's take a look and see kind of interesting. I wonder why it's not. apply per tip. Let's see what happens. Ah, there we go. So you can sort of see now I'm getting a bit of a variation between my foreground and my background color, and they're kind of mixing it up nicely. They're becoming like these sort of purple tones. If I hold it down a bit longer, you get a little bit more of these like magenta tones in here, things like that. So color dynamics can also be something fun to play around with if that's what you're into. And again, like I said, a lot of these are I don't know. You kind of have to dive in and take a look for yourself. If you're into digital art and brushwork and sort of drawing a lot in Photoshop, or interested in getting into that, this is definitely a really good menu to take a closer look at. I'm just sort of showing us these few basic sort of tweaks and effects that we can make, just for the sake of showing you guys and exposing you to them and being able to play around with them a bit more. So I'm going to make sure that I have a clean layer here now. I don't want to have any glowing orbs on it. I want to make sure that my foreground color is set to white. And I'm going to go ahead and just paint on a few. I want to be sort of strategic about where they go, so don't cover up the subject's face. And we're going to do this in a few different stages. So we're going to have like some glow balls that feel like they're in the midground. We're going to have some that feel like they're super close up to the camera in the foreground. And then we're going to make some super tiny ones that feel like little small details that are more floating around our subject instead. But again, this is also a layer styles tutorial. So, I'd like us to get used to applying effects in layer styles. So I'm going to double click on the layer that we just built some of these glow balls on. And I want to apply, another outer glow just to give it a little bit more dreaminess. Maybe instead of pink, we're going to keep it into the blues because this whole sort of scene seems to be very cool toned. So again, I actually think vivid light works well here. Wonder what happens if we use screen. Doesn't really do a good job. Overlay looks a little bit bland. Linear light does another good job too. So play around with the blending mode, see what you like, see what works best for you. I always find a little bit of noise helps a little bit as well, just to blend the edges of our glow into the rest of the image. And the contour, I have a feeling it's going to just work best here with the straight up angle contour. Everything else is going to be a little bit too funky. Probably. That one's not too bad, but anyways, it's up to you. It's up to you how intense you want things to look. I'm just going to leave it on angle. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK with that. So those are kind of our mid-ground, fairy lights. Now it's time to sort of do our super big foreground ones. They're going to be super defocused and close to the camera. So I'm going to increase the size of my brush, and I kind of want to just hover along the outside of my composition here until I get a couple that are pretty off frame. You know what I mean? So they kind of just look like they're gonna be super soft and defocused. We can lower their opacity a bit because they'd be defocused. They're just kind of adding lighting texture and things like that. We can go ahead now and apply another outer glow. This time, if you want to variate the color a little bit, you could change them from blues. We do have some purples in our image, so we could maybe go with a purpley tone this time instead, just to make it a little bit more interesting and dynamic. So I'm going to call these guys like mid glow. I'm going to call these guys foreground glow. And the last thing that I'd like us to look at is going to be the super tiny, cute, small little glow lights that are going to maybe go around like our actual subject matter. So really small brush. Once again, we have white, so we're going to see our white little glows happening here. And we can sort of just brush, maybe, I don't know, you want to be a little bit conservative with this. You don't need it to be like glows everywhere. Just enough to sort of like give it that magical, fantastical sort of sense. And you could leave these white, for a little bit of the variation. Or once again, we can double click and we can set another outer glow, this time maybe into the pinks or something like that. And because they're smaller, their size is going to be really quite small, and their opacity is going to be really low. They're not emitting a huge glow since they're smaller little fairy creatures or whatever you want to maybe think they are. Actually, in this case, I think they look better blue. Yeah, something like that. Cool. Oh, did I draw all of those? What? Oh, I think I just hit cancel by mistake. Whoops. Outer glow. There we go. Sorry, just gonna quickly go and fix that opacity down to like there. Go ahead, hit OK. Now we're gonna call these small glow. Excellent. Let me just double check that I'm not missing anything. These are our big ones. These are our small ones. These are our mid-size. That's a thing. Excellent. So, you know, once again, if you want, you can move your vignette all the way up to the top. The only problem with that is it kind of, you know, dulls down the glows that are quote unquote closer to the camera, kind of obscuring them. So, you know, this was just an exercise in different brush styles and brush dynamics while also applying layer styles to add a level of customization and further enhance the detail of our sort of cool fantasy-esque scene. So, you know, the sky is really the limit when it comes to Photoshop. You can have tons of fun and play around and create all sorts of different customized effects. In our layer styles folder, you'll also notice that I have a Clay Banks unsplash image and a Taylor unsplash image. These guys have to deal with bevel and emboss and the neon, this sort of color overlay outer glow, I think. Anyways, feel free to dig through those as well. They just look at layer styles slightly differently. This one, for example, we look at how to rebuild this sign using bevel and emboss. It's a fairly simple one to grasp, but I'd encourage you to take a look at the PSD anyways. And then this image here, using the same sort of techniques we used in the neon shape, we're just looking at rebuilding the type as it sits in that section. So feel free to look through the other PSDs and see if you can understand what's happening now that we've kind of covered layer styles to a degree. It would be a really good sort of learning opportunity for you guys to take a look at it yourself and see if you can figure out what's going on. But this has been the demonstration for layer styles. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.